Hello, everybody. Hopefully, you're all here for the talk on good documentation practices for clinical trial data. I'm Tanya Moran, and I'm the Senior Quality Assurance and Auditing Manager for WVCTSI. And Shelley Welch will also be presenting with me, and she's the Clinical Services Manager. So just to give you an overview of today's presentation, we're going to go over a few definitions and then regulatory requirements with regards to good documentation practices, the principles of those practices. We'll go through a few case studies and also references, acknowledgements, and an overall conclusion. And then we'll share with you the WVCTSI Clinical Trial Services and discuss any questions that you might have. So first, we'll go through some of the definitions. So for those of you that might not be aware, the good clinical practices, and this is the definition that's from the ICH E6 document. It's a little bit more user-friendly. So a standard for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analyses, and reporting of clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and reported results are credible and accurate, and that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of trial subjects are protected. Now that's quite a mouthful, but today we'll be specifically analyzing and discussing the portion related to reporting of clinical trials. Now in relation to good documentation practice, the GDPs ensure reliable and consistent transfer of information and maintains accuracy, clarity, traceability, and quality results. So this should enable you to provide legible, concise, accurate, and traceable records. Source data, also taken from the ICH document, is all information in original records and certified copies of original records of clinical findings, observations, or other activities in a clinical trial necessary for the reconstruction and evaluation of the trial. So what's important to keep in mind is once the trial is completed, even though all of the study conduct may have gone on without any hitch and very successfully, the source data and the data that is kept to show the trial conduct is as important as the actual steps taken during the trial conduct. The audit trail is a documentation that allows reconstruction of the course of events. So these are just some examples of source documents. Usually people refer to source documents in relation to case report forms and electronic health records, but it's important to keep in mind that this also includes informed consent forms, IRB and sponsored correspondence, any other correspondence. So for example, for multi-site studies, this would include correspondence between the sites, any notes to file, laboratory results, visits or contact notes, questionnaires and diaries that were completed during the study, surveys, and also all the assessments and test results. This is just to give you an example that there are FDA warning letters that have been issued to clinical investigators for clinical trials. And two frequently cited issues are that you failed to ensure that the investigation was conducted according to the investigational plan, which is the protocol, and also you failed to maintain adequate and accurate case histories that record all observations and other data pertinent to the investigation on each individual administered the investigational drug or employed as a control in the investigation. So the cited issues here show that documentation of these is extremely important. So showing that you followed the protocol, so every requirement from the protocol should be traceable in the data, and also having accurate case histories. If you do not, this can lead to comments such as your failure to maintain adequate case histories compromises the validity and integrity of data captured at your site. So it's a little bit cliche, but as we keep saying, if it's not documented, it did not happen. So this is from the 3 most frequent findings in a selection of 6 FDA warning letters of 2016. So the first one related to the failure to adhere to the protocol. So it includes ensuring that study subjects met the protocol inclusion and exclusion before enrollment, delay of subject randomization until the screening lab values were collected. The second category was for maintaining adequate subject records. And so there was a failure to maintain study records demonstrating that subjects met protocol-specified laboratory eligibility criteria, and also a failure to accurately document who completed study procedures, including screening and follow-up physical and neurological evaluations. The third category that was established was maintaining adequate records of the disposition of drug, and so failure to maintain any drug disposition records. So these are just some examples of relatively recent FDA warning letter contents. And overall, the trends continue to be the same with previous years for FDA sightings. Except for new this year, there was a deficiency of the investigational product inaccurately being represented as safe or effective by clinical investigators. So just a review of the regulatory requirements. The documentation is the means by which regulatory agencies and sponsor auditors can assess the compliance of study conduct to regulations, protocol, and standard operating procedures. So again, it's really important to remember that they are not present during study conduct, and the high standards that you take during study conduct should be represented in the documentation of the trials. There is a public and private collaboration called CTTI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, that have coined a new definition for the term quality. And they've assessed that quality is the absence of errors that matter. So what's important to remember here is not that you can run a trial without any errors, but you have to mitigate the risk of having any errors that would impact either human subject safety or the integrity of the trial data. And by integrating documentation milestones, as we'll be discussing, and reducing the risk of errors that could have an impact on the study. So this is just the concept of study design and quality. You know, everybody says you can't audit quality back into a study. So what's important is that things are set up in such a way that it will reduce errors that matter. So having a clear protocol with clear instructions that people will not interpret different ways, having appropriate personnel training. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows what forms to use. They're aware of the protocol requirements. Change control, that's one that's really hard to kind of keep track of, but a lot of errors in a study can occur when a change happens. So when you have an amendment that could direct that you need a form to be changed as well, or any change on a study, that's where you have to be more alert as to this change, what else does it affect for the study, and what else needs to be changed? Do we need more training? Just keep in mind that's a key area that can lead to error. Clear CRF, so case report forms where you collect the data, clear CRFs with prompts. So everybody's clear what they have to record, and there's no omissions and there's no errors with regards to that. A clear informed consent process. As we know, that's one of the pinnacle points for keeping subject safety, and review of data. So having QC processes in place, monitoring in place to review the data on a periodic basis, and not just correct errors that occur, but think about how can we prevent those errors from happening again on the study. These are the ALCOAC principles. So this is what was required in the ICH guidance with regards to source data. So the first one is it should be attributable. So it should be clear to identify who recorded the data and when. And also keep in mind that all these principles apply to electronic data. As we're going forth with clinical trials now, there's more and more electronic systems that come forth. Bless you. And these don't apply just to paper records. These also apply to electronic systems. So it should be clear who recorded the data and when for all data recorded. It should be legible, so all data can easily be read and understood. It should be contemporaneous, so that entries are recorded in real time and not 3 days later. I think this is what it was. Should be original, so the first record and no transcriptions. Should be accurate, so the data represent the observations and the facts that actually happened. And should be complete, so entries should be up to date, units should be included. There's a lot of information here, but these are the principles of good documentation practices to keep in mind when recording all data for clinical trials. So what does this mean in practice? All principles apply to all data regardless of media used. So paper and electronic, as I just said. Raw and source data should never be discarded. Use black or blue permanent or indelible ink. Multiple pages should be numbered so that you know that you have the complete set. Record information directly on the source document promptly. That seems easy, but you have to remember there's a standard of care where it might be acceptable to write things on different forms and collect it later, or, you know, what we see is definitely no sticky notes, post-it notes, data on post-it notes. That's not appropriate. No overwriting, and ditto marks, which is like the quotation marks that say same as above, or arrows are not permissible, and blank spaces should be filled or appropriately annotated. And then just a few more points. Keeping signature logs to identify the individual signatures and initials. Predating and backdating is not permitted. So if you realize that something is not dated, you can date it that day if there's source data to qualify that being done, but you have to write a note to explain the situation. All entries must be signed and dated by the person performing the task. Date format should be consistent within a document. Date should be handwritten, so they shouldn't be typed or electronically pre-printed unless obtained through a validated system. Signatures and initials must be personally dated, so not dated by someone else, a third party. And identify additional printouts with identifiable information. So if you're printing out something and it's not clear from that printout information, you can include the project number, the subject information, the signature and date of the person who generated it, so that if that sheet doesn't get put into the binder that immediate time, we know where to file it. And of course, we say all this, but mistakes do happen. So when an issue is found, it's important to correct the issue promptly. So if it can be completed or corrected using these principles, that should be done. And then also look at preventing the issue from reoccurring. So if it's a deviation, enter the deviation so that follow-up can be performed as needed. And I think sometimes there's a culture of people not wanting to write deviations, but it's actually a good thing to do. The deviations allow us to track what happens and allows us to see maybe what was the cause of the deviation and to document the corrective and preventive actions that can be applied to that system, and to have people alerted to that so that it can be prevented for other cases on that study or other studies. So a deviation is not necessarily always bad. For corrections, the general principle is to correct the error without obscuring the original data so that you can maintain an audit trail. And then initial and date the corrections at the time they are made. and add a brief statement for the change if the reason is not clearly evident. And then, of course, a reminder, no use of whiteout, no erasers, or correction pens. So this is just an example of appropriate and not appropriate corrections. So this is on a case report form where the first entry is correct. It's complete and everything's there. The second one is not correct. It's missing some information. The third one is correct because there was an error, but the error was corrected. And the last one is not correct because the previous entry can no longer be read. So there's no clear audit trail for the data. Some more principles for data maintenance and handling. So data points required by the study protocol outside of standard of care should be documented and collected using subject coding. All versions of documents should be maintained, and they should be maintained in a location to ensure protection of data throughout the study conduct. So they should be locked, they should be bound, anything that can be established to maintain safety. For multi-site studies, the originals can be maintained at satellite locations during the study conduct, with certified copies provided to the PI. However, the originals, it's expected that they will be returned to the main site for long-term retention. All documents to be kept shall be maintained in long-term storage with restricted access. And keeping in mind, again, this applies to electronic data. Some important concepts, that's why we're here today. Qualifications and training. So it's important to document qualifications, and that's done through having an up-to-date CV and licensure. And also important to document ongoing training throughout your career. Having city training is a requirement here for good clinical practices, for example, and what we're doing today, good documentation practices. So if you want to turn to the handouts that you've been given, I can give you a few minutes to read. What we're looking at are specifically sections 1A and 2. And then what we'll try to determine is what is the documentation issue, what corrections can be performed, and what measures could have been put in place to prevent the issue. The issue is that it's not accurate. The person that actually collected the data is not identified, and the data should not be collected using another person's login. And I chose this example because we're getting more and more electronic systems. People don't always transfer the information that we've learned about good clinical practices and good documentation to electronic systems. But this is a really good example of that something that you wouldn't do on paper, you can't do in real life. If the patient was responsible for documenting their own data, nobody can go in and document it for them. So what correction can be performed in this case? Well, there's two things. There's corrective actions and preventive actions. So corrective actions is what you can do to correct the issue in that case. And then preventive action is what can you put in place to prevent it from happening again. So in this case, concretely, what can you do for that study? Well, that's looking at the future, but in the case, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So in this case, it's a protocol deviation, and then with the protocol deviation, you would have to write what actually happened on the study, and then probably retraining is required. As part of the deviation documentation, you would write that you would retrain. And also the impact on the study needs to be assessed. So going back to what you said, the investigator with the sponsor or whoever's in charge of that study would have to determine, is that data going to be removed from the analysis? Are we going to do something else? So the impact on the study and what those results, if they'll be applicable to the study or not, that has to be discussed and documented. And then what measures could have been put in place to prevent the issue? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But in this case, I think the problem is there were a lot of entries that weren't being done in time because the patients weren't apt at that time to record the data. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, we didn't have access to the protocol to know exactly what was, if that was part of the eligibility requirements for that study or what was documented specifically. But what I looked at is probably it has to be assessed whether the patient documenting the data themselves, whether or not it was part of the study goals. And then if it was not part of the study goal, then you can have an alternate method described in the protocol for collecting the assessments if the subject was not able to. For example, you could have it on a form by the study coordinator or have an alternate method put in place if it had to be recorded at that time. And then if the use of the system by the subject was part of the study goal, which we don't know, then you can reassess the timing of data collection to ensure better protocol compliance. So probably there was a problem with how the study was structured, and when people sat down to design the study, maybe they should have known that at that time it was not going to be possible for most of the patients to record the data themselves, and think about that. So whether or not it was part of the study goals and what else we can do. And that's really important. And that's the point here, is to think about study design and assess from the start if there will be some hindrances being compliant with the protocol requirements, and identify those up front before the study starts and not down the road when you've already had 4 protocol deviations. So just keeping in mind challenges that can come with the study with having proper documentation. And that's, the new trend of this quality by design is thinking about those things, making sure that you have the forms and everything in place to be able to adhere to these principles. So this is just a second kind of example or case study that we can look at. So this is an example case report form that I came up with for my project Awesome. And I want you to let me know if you see anything that's not appropriate based on what we've discussed today. The scribble, which is called overwriting. Yes. The whiteout. Well, yeah, that's a sticky note. It didn't come out well on the scan. Sorry about that. So sticky note, that's a very good one. So that means that the data is not original. Yeah. That really good. Very good. Yeah. Is that all we have? There's one more. No units. Great. So the scribble or the overwrite, the units and decimal places. So because there's not actual prompts to let you know, are you supposed to record to 2 or decimal places, to 1, to round it off to the whole number, what the units are. It doesn't prompt anyone to actually document that information, and it can be documented inconsistently. So just to think about that. And then, as you pointed out, the signature and date. So nothing here on that sheet was attributable to know who actually collected this data. So this is just a recap to identify the principles of good documentation practices that were not being followed in the previous case. So the decimal places and units for the vitals was unclear, so the data is not complete. The data collected is not attributable because there's no signature and date. The data collected on the yellow sticky will need to be transcribed and then will not be original. And there is also risk that data could be lost. The correction method for the weight made the original entry no longer legible. So to prevent these issues, the form should be updated to indicate the required decimal values and units and prompt for signature and date. The height value should be indicated on the form with units and with a notification as transcribed data. And you'll actually have to keep the source. And then retraining on good documentation practices would probably be recommended in this case. These are just some reference documents from which the information today came from, and also if you want some further reading about this subject. And I would like to thank Shelley Welch and Ginger and Julie Lockman for the contribution for this training material as well. Does anybody have any questions about anything we spoke about today, or how to implement it within your groups or your day-to-day working life? So just to go back to the general principles of why this is important, this promotes good clinical practice, and it helps ensure human subject protection and reliability of trial results. And I want to thank you all for your commitment to clinical trial quality. Yeah? Is that for standard of care or for study specific data being collected? Okay, can you repeat your question then, please? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What is their signature actually showing? They can't, is a review, an approval? From what my experience and from the regulations that I know, there should be a documented procedure that describes this and that attributes that this signature, what it represents. Is it a review? Is it an approval? And in what circumstances, which one is it? And does it require further prompt or further comment? I would have to see case by case probably. But there's also a shift towards, for EMRs, it's there's no validation that's required, but for any other electronic systems that are used for collection or for electronic signatures, there are regulations that exist that have requirements for those types of things, and I can provide you all those guidances if you don't have them. So you said the EMRs are not valid. They're not required. They're not, at this time, they're not required to be fully validated under like the 21 CFR Part 11. The guidances actually say that they are not requesting that the EMR, the electronic EMRs, be validated in the same way as the requirements for 21 CFR Part 11. But in the future, when there's more, they're looking at interoperability, and what they're actually looking at more and more is EMR systems are transferring data directly to electronic EDC systems, and that requires more attention. The reason I asked is that I've had sponsors giving questionnaires to ask what ethic is CFR Part 11 compliant. I can show you that. The answer is no. I'll show you the guidances. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. There's different requirements for what needs to be verified for those different systems. Any other questions? No?
Well, my part is really not very with a lot of detail, and looking out on the audience, most of you all know what we do, so just bear with me just a little bit. For those that don't know CTSI and the clinical trials group, I wanted to make sure that you understood what services we could provide. Administrative support, you saw Mega in the background. She's our administrator. Administrative support can help with general office procedures, credentialing of the staff, making sure that we have the CV and the licensure when we're talking about the study team, and making sure that we have city training assigned and completed. We have accounting support, so helping with budgeting and the contract with the sponsors in particular for industry sponsored, with invoicing and financial reporting as well. And then regulatory support. Michelle is here, and she is our regulatory person that can assist with IRB submissions, renewals, and adverse event reporting. And then we use a system which Layla knows really well, Encore. That is unfamiliar with a lot of people that come to our services for CTSI. They're not familiar with our clinical trial management system. So many times when we're working with investigators that are funded by the CTSI, they're unfamiliar with this system, but we do use it to track study status, adverse events. We do the invoicing out of there. We do deviations, IRBs, everything about that trial is put into Encore, and we do a lot of the reporting for CTSI and others out of the Encore system. So though it's not campus-wide required, it is required when you're getting CTSI support. We do feel very strongly that we have to use the Encore system. And then study coordination. We have a couple of study coordinators in our unit, Louise and Aubrey, which are both here. So they can help make sure that the protocol is being followed. We can help with study selection and doing feasibility, review the protocol to make sure, especially in the investigator-initiated study, to make sure that what you guys put on paper is actually, you know, feasible to do. In addition, do we have the right patient population to be able to do that? And part of what we use now to help with that is a system called Trinetics. So if you're not familiar with Trinetics, I think it is a very useful tool for researchers and study coordinators as well. We've been using Trinetics to have a pool of patients to, you know, as soon as the study is operational and we're able to enroll, we can use Trinetics to be able to identify patients that may qualify for the study. So if you're not familiar with Trinetics, I won't go into it too much. But if you're not and you're interested, make sure you see me because it is a very good tool. And then we can certainly work pre-award and coordinating the visits, whether it's a site evaluation visits for the, you know, sponsor to come here and make sure that we have adequate supplies and adequate facility for the clinical trial. Certainly help with training at the investigator meetings, whether that be in face-to-face or over the phone, and organization of labs and pharmacy and radiology, whatever, you know, coordination means. To me, it's everything else that the study team is needing for the protocol to be successful. It's a broad term for sure. And then actual screening of the patient when we're talking about the study coordination, screening the patients based on inclusion, exclusion, consenting. It's a role for the PI and the coordinator to do for the most part, scheduling visits, scheduling procedures, completion of procedures, data gathering and data entry into the EDCs, whether that be REDCap. For the most part, the CTSI investigators use REDCap, and we can certainly help with design of the REDCap and then also entry into the data. Drug accountability, we assist with that, and certainly communication. And then importantly, adverse events, identifying them and reporting them accurately to those that need. And then during study closeout, just to make sure that we're locking the data, everything is there, and participate in the closeout visits. So if you have particular needs, those that are in particular interested in writing for pilot grants or some type of funding out of CTSI, we'd be happy to assist you. So in case you don't know CTSI, I think everybody here, but we just put a little plug in there for us. So how you can join on the website. And then also to request the services, we use a system now called iLabs. Emily could talk a lot more about iLabs if you would like her to, probably an hour worth. But on all the services we're tracking, all the services that we perform are being tracked in a system called iLabs. And so if you're requesting our services, we would ask you to become a member of CTSI and then get an iLabs account. It takes a very short time to get that approved, and then you can request services. And you can request the services of my clinical trials group, but also any of the services that CTSI would provide. You would request those through iLabs. And I think that's it. Yeah. Any questions about CTSI?